Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It gives you the tools and inspiration to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. This is where we explore how to cultivate remarkable cultures that scale and evolve as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
If you think about it, we're shaped not only by, there's an assumption that it's national culture. That's the thing that sort of looms the largest when you're interacting with someone. But the fact of the matter is, as you said, what shapes our orientation towards the world, the way that we act, our values, also how we think and so on, especially how we behave, is a function of so many other things. It's a function of our life experience. It's a function of our professional cultural background. It's a function of our organizational culture, and of course, our personality.
This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind accelerator program where culture leaders get hands-on support and guidance on how to reach their goals faster, especially now in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. CultureBrained connects you with outstanding peers on the same journey, but also with world-class experts, including people you know from the show. And they all help you identify and implement new, better ways of creating a culture where people do their best work. Check it out at tinyurl.com/culturebrained. And no need to write it down. There's a link in the show notes. Have you ever felt like you are not connecting with someone and that the barrier that stands in the way is cultural? It might be that the jokes you make don't land, or the emails you send seem to miss the mark, or the way you lead meetings doesn't really resonate with everyone in the room. It's a bit like trying to tune into a radio station, but finding yourself between frequencies where everything just sounds like static. This is a common experience in today's global workforce, where teams are more diverse than ever, spanning across different cultures, countries, and different backgrounds. My guest today, Andy Molinsky, is a psychology professor at Brandeis University and an expert in the field of intercultural relationship building. He recently published a new book, Forging Bonds in a Global Workforce. And in this conversation, we're exploring some of the ideas from the book. If you're trying to navigate the maze of cultural do's and don'ts, you'll find that Andy really comes with a flashlight and a map. He gets real about the missteps and the magic of working across cultures. And he talks about everything from the art of small talk across borders to the deep stuff like building trust with global teammates. He also shares practical tools and anecdotes that help bridge cultural gaps with grace. Whether you are leading a team from Tokyo to Toronto, or just curious about making genuine connections in your multicultural office, I'm sure you'll find this episode with Andy Molinsky enlightening. Enjoy.
My name's Andy Molinsky. I am a professor of organizational behavior and international management at Brandeis University in Boston, in the USA. I am essentially an organizational psychologist, and in addition to doing research, I love writing books. I've written 3 books. My first book was called Global Dexterity, about stepping outside your cultural comfort zone. My second book was called Reach, which is simply about stepping outside your comfort zone. And my new book is Forging Bonds in the Global Workforce, is about building relationships across cultures. So I do other things, but that's a basic bio.
Welcome to the Culture Lab, Andy. I'm really keen to talk about you and your book, Forging Bonds in a Global Workforce. But before we go there, there's one question that I ask all of our guests, and it's about the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person. How did you grow up, and what impact did it have on who you are today?
I grew up in I guess what you would call like a very monocultural background, in the sense that, well, at least in terms of national culture. So I was born in Boston in the United States. My parents are both Americans. I'm old enough that we didn't have the internet when I grew up. We only had a certain amount of television stations. I'm saying in terms of exploring the world beyond your house and so on. Never was really able to much. I had never traveled overseas outside the country until I was in university. So I really lived in terms of the cultural influences, I think like American. Now, America is a big country. It's a huge country, right? So I was born in the Northeast, and the Northeast, my family, one cultural influence, which is really a professional cultural influence, I'd say, is that my parents, I think I came from sort of an academic background. My dad's a professor. And so I think that influenced me. I remember as a kid, he taught foreign born teachers how to teach English when they go back to their countries. And so I remember having very interesting dinner parties as a kid at our house with all his students, bringing all these at the time, which were very exotic dishes, which were, probably their favorite food from their countries, coming to our house, and these one after another would bring them. And this was also an era where we didn't have as many, at least where I was from, we didn't have as many international cuisines. So that's really my background. I didn't have much of a multicultural background at all. For me, that came later.
Exactly. And your new book, is all about building relationships across cultures. So I wonder what drew you to this topic apart from these early experiences, trying out foreign cuisines that your dad's students shared with you during those dinner parties. What made you curious about this topic?
I was always interested in languages. Even though I hadn't traveled, I was very interested in languages. And in college, I studied Russian. And this was in the Cold War era, at the end, sort of towards the end of the Cold War. And I was always very curious about Russia. And I was mostly curious because if you don't speak the language, you hear the accent, or you hear the language, but the accent is sort of psychologically associated with negativity in the United States, because of course all the bad guys in the movies were always Russian. So you get this very negative feeling about it. But I was always curious to try to understand, I think beyond that, like what people were actually saying. So like to try to like sort of circumvent the stereotype of the voice of the accent. And so I don't know, I loved languages. I studied in high school, actually. I went to a very rigorous Latin high school, and I studied 6 years of Latin. And so I was very interested in sort of even the way that languages are structured. And so I took Russian, and Russian actually has a lot in common with Latin in terms of the complexity of the language, I think. I really enjoyed it. I was all ready to go abroad for my very first experience when I learned that I did not have enough Russian to go abroad. Now, in those days, you needed to have a certain level, at least from where I was from, to be able to go to the, former Soviet Union. I didn't. And so I thought to myself, I really still want to go abroad, but I can't go there. Where's a place that I could go that has a different language, but where I could learn a bit of the language fairly quickly and then have enough to be able to go? Turned out Spain was the place. And so I studied beginning Spanish. I had never studied it before, and I really enjoyed it. And I went to Spain with 1 year of Spanish. And that's where this all happened. When I first stepped foot in this foreign culture, in this foreign country, never having been abroad before, that experience was just that's one of the most memorable experiences in my life, I think. Like stepping into this world where people are speaking this different language. I never really heard it before on the streets or anything. There's this whole world of, I don't know, stores and government and transportation and media and everything like that's just totally different from ours, but they've figured it out. I think that's where it started for me. And then it went on from there.
I really resonate with your life story generally because I grew up in a monoculture as well, behind the Iron Curtain, actually. So on the other side. And we were quite isolated as well. The impact that it had on me was that curiosity about other cultures and how other people live. And I also vividly remember my first trip abroad, which was to London. And you can imagine, right? A 16-year-old girl from communist Poland suddenly landing in London, this amazing cosmopolitan city. And it really blew my mind as well. Even if, you watch movies and read books, nothing compares to being just immersed in that sort of an experience. And I think you quickly realize that people really live and think and work quite differently from how you are used to. And for me, that was the beginning of my journey as well, just trying to figure out what role culture plays in our lives and then clearly in business as well, since this is the area that I focus on most. But I totally see how that would lead you to where you are today. And needless to say, that especially for our listeners, I think a lot of our listeners are people who work for international organizations, globally distributed teams. And they are certainly really interested in learning from you about how to build deep and meaningful relationships across cultures, the sort of relationships that really help us do our best work. So I will just, dive straight into the topic and ask you, what are the key skills that we need to thrive in a multicultural work environment?
There are a lot of important skills, and I think about them in terms of two different sets of skills that we focus on in the book. One is about, I guess the most basic way to say it would be avoiding the bad stuff, avoiding the mistakes. And then the other set of skills is creating the good stuff, creating those connections. And so I think those are two sort of buckets of skills that we focus on in the book. And I'd be happy to elaborate, but those are the two sort of basic sets of skills that people need to have. Yeah.
So let's unpack the bad stuff and how and what sort of bad stuff we need to avoid. I know that there are some hidden biases that can really interfere with relationship building across cultures. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure. What I'll say at the outset is that there's a reason why these things are quote unquote the bad stuff. And it's because we can almost short circuit or end the potential for a relationship before it even starts. So if you think about relationships, at the very beginning, they're the most vulnerable, right? Because someone could do or say something that just rubs you the wrong way. And you could just basically lose motivation, lose interest, and then exit the relationship. And so those impressions, early impressions, are very, very important. And so if someone acts in a certain way that's different, let's say, something you're not expecting, you could easily make a negative interpretation of that behavior. For instance, I don't know, let's say they don't show as much emotion, positive emotion as you're used to. Let's say that's from your culture. And you could very quickly draw a negative impression. They don't like me, or they're weird, or they're strange, or something. And then you can feel this is uncomfortable. I don't like this. This makes me somewhat anxious. And then you can very quickly draw the conclusion that you don't like them, you're not interested in the relationship, and you can lose motivation or even exit the situation. So if you think about it, these things are really, really important, especially early. The bad stuff is, the idea that you could fixate on national culture, for instance. You could assume someone is going to be characteristic of the culture that they come from. That's one example of sort of the quote unquote bad stuff. You could stereotype. You could assume that someone is characteristic of your assumptions about that particular culture. You could project. Projection means that you assume other people or think or feel exactly like you do when that's not necessarily the case. Those are some examples. And I think that having a sophisticated view of what you might expect when you meet someone is important. I always like to call it's important to have a sort of a working hypothesis, like a prediction. I think it's still important to read up on how people from this particular culture might act or what their tendencies might be and so on. I think that's valuable, but it should be a tentative, preliminary hypothesis that you're very willing to discard once you actually meet the person and you learn a bit more about them and their personality.
Yeah, this is such a valuable point because obviously, personally, I come from a culture that, from Poland, we are quite straightforward and quite serious too, just like Russians, by the way. And one of the things that I do remember about culture clashes is when McDonald's entered the Russian market. I don't know if you know the story. And they quickly realized that it was simply impossible to make the Russian employees to smile. And so they had to roll out this entire training on smiling. And when they dug deeper, they realized people told them that to Russians, someone who's smiling all the time is basically synonymous with a crazy person because life is difficult and life is a serious thing, and only a crazy person would smile all the time. So it's a really major culture clash, and I think that knowing these stereotypes about Eastern European countries, I certainly have been classified as such by some people. And for example, people would expect from me that I would be very straightforward and would just say it like it is. But actually, this is not my personality. And I'm much higher context kind of person that doesn't feel very comfortable with confrontation. Do you have any stories that illustrate that and how that can hold people back, especially in international organizations, from having a successful collaboration with their colleagues across the seas or in a different country?
It's such a good point, and you see it. I mean, I have so many stories. It's one of the most common things, I think, because if you think about it, we're shaped not only by, there's an assumption that it's national culture. That's the thing that sort of looms the largest when you're interacting with someone. But the fact of the matter is, as you said, what shapes our orientation towards the world, the way that we act, our values, also how we think, and so on, especially how we behave, is a function of so many other things. It's a function of our life experience, it's a function of our professional cultural background, it's a function of our organizational culture, and of course, our personality. So, gosh, an example, so many examples. I've been surprised myself so many times, assuming that someone was going to be a certain way, and then they were completely the opposite. I remember there's a story, I think, in the book where like a couple summers ago, I was asked by a Singaporean Chinese man who was the head of a consulting firm, and he wanted to collaborate with me on some work, and he happened to be traveling to the United States, and I met him in Harvard Square, which is close to Boston, near Harvard University. We met for a drink, and I figured, like, this CEO of this consulting firm, Singaporean Chinese, I sort of felt like he was going to be fairly, I don't know, somewhat serious. And also the context matters too. I thought it was this meeting to potentially collaborate, and I thought that I'd have to make a positive impression. Now, I tend to be extremely informal. I'm always like at the absolute edge of appropriateness in terms of informality. Like, I'll teach in like a t-shirt. I just don't like formality so much. But I really amped it up to be formal with this guy. It was definitely a step up for me. I see where he's sitting down. He was sitting down in an outside courtyard. I walk up these stairs to get to him, and I'm ready, sort of bracing myself for this interaction. And he comes up with the biggest smile you have ever seen. And he comes up, and I think he must have hugged me. And if he didn't hug me, he put his arm around me and gave me a big handshake. I mean, this is just one little example, but this happens all the time. He completely disconfirmed every single assumption that I had. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay, I made that mistake. But what's good is that in that case, I had a hypothesis. Hypothesis sounds like a technical scientific word, but I think it's an important word because it's preliminary. Hypotheses are meant to be confirmed or disconfirmed based on data and information. And so that's why I like to use that word. It's a tentative assessment, but you're very open to changing. And I was. So, but that's one example.
Yeah, it happens all the time. And I almost wonder whether, what's the extent of knowledge that we need to have about other cultures, given the fact that at the end of the day, every individual is shaped by so many different things that they won't necessarily reflect what their national culture is. How do you think about this? How do you think about, yeah, that level of knowledge and understanding of other cultures that we need to have in order to be able to work well with other nationalities?
There are a couple of things that matter. I think that it's not just people, it's situations. And so situations in a culture have certain norms, and situations can be tighter or looser in terms of the norms, right? Even in the US, which is a fairly informal culture, I think, a job interview is a fairly formal situation. And so you want to be able to understand what the norms are of a situation as well. Now, those norms, though, are going to differ because if you have a job interview in Manhattan at a large Fortune 500 company in one of those skyscrapers, that's probably going to be quite formal, right? Whereas if you're in a tiny little town, I don't know, in the middle of the country, and you're interviewing in a very a small town country style organization or something like that, it's probably going to be quite informal on the scale, right? So I think the situation matters a lot. I also think that understanding or having a prediction about whether someone is likely to be more monocultural or cosmopolitan, I think is important. And that's maybe a mistake I made with this gentleman who is the Singaporean head of the consulting firm. Probably should have thought to myself, gosh, this is an international consulting firm. Singapore's a tiny little country. He obviously must travel a lot. And so he is probably quite cosmopolitan. And so I should actually probably have less of a strong prediction of how he might be. So I think those are two factors that I would think are important. But again, I think we need to be sort of detectives a little bit. We need to really observe and be open to the unexpected, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that your research delves deeply into the nuances of something that I thought we all share across cultures, but actually it's not true, which is small talk. So, would you mind sharing some insights on how small talk can be effectively leveraged in global teams to build rapport, to build trust, to start a relationship? Because I think there's a moment before we manage to build a relationship where somehow we need to connect. And in Western countries, we very often resort to small talk. And we had this conversation before this interview. Not all cultures are actually so happy with having small talk conversations as others. So, what do we need to know about using small talk to build rapport and build trust?
So this is a big topic, even though it says small talk. It's a very important, interesting topic. And in the process of starting to do this book and the research for this book, we had such different perspectives on small talk from some early interviewers that we decided we needed to do a separate interview project about small talk. Because there's a lot of viewpoints out there. Like there's some people who say, I mean, everyone does small talk around the world, and then there's some people say, no, 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 this is extremely cultural specific, and it's only these countries that do small talk, and so on. And others feel that small talk is incredibly superficial and meaningless and so on. And it's very American. I know it's not only Americans that make small talk, but so we wanted to really try to understand it. So what we did is we interviewed people from, gosh, I think it must have been 12 different countries, something like that, and interviewed between 5 and 10 people from each country, trying to get a sense. It's not a full study of small talk, but it's deeper than we had gone before. And so what we found is that in the professional global work circles that we're studying, like we're studying people who are in the professional world, right? Who work for companies, who do global work. In that world, what we found is that small talk is what we called semi or quasi universal. It is not universal. It is not true that every country and culture and so on is pro small talk or small talk's a common feature or facet, but that in the arenas where a lot of people do global work, it is quite common, even if you come from a country where it's not quite common. So an example is that someone from Korea, that was of all the countries that we studied, Korea was the least likely to likes to have small talk. It's not a common thing in Korea to make small talk.
Generally, or just in the business context?
Well, we didn't study outside the business context, so I don't know. It's quite possible that with people who are close to you in your inner circle and your in group, it is. I don't know. We didn't study that. But in the professional circles that we studied, we found that it's not particularly common. But that doesn't mean that someone from Korea who's operating in a multinational context, who's doing work abroad, who's working in a global organization, it does not mean that that person's not going to make small talk. In other words, that person could make small talk. In fact, I did some executive education a few years ago for a very large Korean global company, and there were maybe 20 managers from Korea who were in Boston for this project, and I remember making small talk with many of them over lunch. So again, you cannot stereotype based on the country. There could be a tendency or a prediction. You can't assume. We did find one very strong finding in our research was power, that in many countries, it's not typical at all to make small talk with a superior. I think those power dynamics are very strong. So you could make small talk maybe with a colleague, with a peer, but you're much less likely to do it with a superior. Now, that's not true in the United States, I'll tell you. Well, again, there are nuances and subtleties depending on the organizational culture, right? There could be a strong organizational culture, but if I had to generalize, it's actually fairly acceptable for someone to make small talk with someone who's a superior. In fact, it's actually probably a very smart thing because you want to build a relationship with your boss, even maybe with your boss's boss, and so on and so forth. So we studied small talk. We studied different little micro strategies that people can use to try to facilitate small talk. It happens to be a topic I just happen to be very interested in.
I would love for you to share some of these micro strategies with us, because that would be my next question. Like what are the best practices when it comes to small talk? How can we use it, yeah, to our advantage and to cultivate healthy relationships with others?
I'll mention some of these, but I want to say that small talk is not, you typically don't build a relationship with small talk, but you start a relationship with small talk. So it's critical for building rapport, which I think is very important because those are the seeds of a growing potential relationship. And so let's see, what are some tips? I'll think of a few. One is that people often forget that they have more in common with a stranger than they think they do, and especially if they're in the same room or same physical space or even same virtual space. And you can use that to your advantage. So if you are looking for a conversation starter, if you're in the same physical room, maybe you see it's raining outside and it's very obviously raining, or maybe you see there's some interesting paintings on the wall, or maybe there's an interesting map in the corner of the city, or whatever it might be. Or maybe there's a certain type of food that you find that you're curious about or that looks good, or maybe the other person is carrying a backpack that has a flag on it and you're not sure what flag that is and you're curious about it. I mean, there's a million different examples. Could even do it virtually as well. Like you could say to me, "Oh, wow, it looks like it's snowing out." It's not, but like yeah, that even virtually potentially, but but there are ways that you can leverage these things in the immediate environment. Another tactic that I think is very useful is to ask open-ended questions instead of closed-ended questions. I'll start with a close-ended question. That's one that invites a yes or no answer. Do you like this conference? Versus, what do you think about the conference so far? So do you like this conference sort of is a yes or no phrasing, or did you have a good vacation? Versus like, I'd love to hear about your vacation, or what kinds of things did you do on your vacation? Something like that. The very phrasing of the question. And the reason that matters for small talk is because the more you ask an open-ended question, you're likely to get more information from the other person. Not always, but it increases the odds that you're going to get more information from the other person. And then when the other person provides more information, then you might be able to find something in what they say that is a potential connection, right? This is someone you don't know, and you're looking to create similarities. You're looking to find similarities or connections, and they have to be authentic. You can't pretend because that's not going to work. That's not going to actually work to build a relationship. If you ask about someone's trip in an open-ended way and they tell you that they went to Poland, and then they went to Germany, let's say, and you say, "Oh, wow, Poland, I've always wanted to go there." Or, "We actually went to Poland last summer. Did you go to Krakow?" I don't know. Whatever it is, like, and you can start, you might think that's a superficial conversation, but that then might move to a different, like Krakow. "Oh my gosh, Krakow, that's actually where I'm from." That can move the conversation in a particular direction, and you might be able to discover similarities. Maybe not, by the way, maybe not. Or conversations are organic. You cannot predict them. It's not going to definitely mean that the conversation is going to lead to a relationship, but it can increase the odds. That's all you're after, really. And so that's another example. I just say one more key about small talk is that I think that it's important to have a healthy balance of listening and speaking. A lot of people say, be a good listener, which I think is very important because if you listen very carefully, you actually might be able to find these commonalities and connections. And you can also show your genuine, authentic interest by listening to someone. You don't want to only listen because you also want to share. And for someone to start to get to know you a little bit, to create that little sense of rapport, you also need to share. We find that it's effective to share what we call semi personal information. Like you're not sharing the most personal information about yourself necessarily. But if you share something that is personal, a viewpoint, a perspective, something you like, something that you liked, something that you found interesting, that's semi personal. That's a way to advance the connection a little bit. You might find commonalities, you might even find disagreements. You can share something about yourself. And when you do that, you start to build the beginning foundations.
That can be quite important, especially in the business context where we have this professional persona. It's almost like we are humanizing ourselves. We're showing that human side of us, which is so important, of course, because at the end of the day, it's human to human interaction, even if it's happening in the business context. And I've heard that it's even sometimes useful to admit to some sort of vulnerability, a small one, like, for example, oh my God, my legs are killing me, these shoes or whatever it might be. Just especially, woman to woman, it's a frequent conversation about shoes, something that or you make a hypothesis that the other person will relate to and resonate with. So I have so many questions about this, Andy, because small talk is actually not so easy. And I find it particularly difficult these days with remote work. So I know that people have these back-to-back meetings, and sometimes you have a half an hour meeting to discuss business, and you don't want it to be impersonal. So of course you try to do some small talk at the beginning. And I wonder whether you have any sense or whether you have done any research around, how long or where do you know and how do you shift to the business conversation from there? To me, it always feels awkward. So I'm also, asking for selfish reasons because I do want to put people at ease and I do want to connect. And I always try to do something at the beginning of the meeting. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking, oh my gosh, we only have 30 minutes to discuss this, and I want to be respectful of their time. And we really need to start talking business now. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts are that people have a variety of different comfort zones around this topic, right? You're going to find people who really want to just get down to business and they're not comfortable at all with small talk. And you can even find cultures where that might be the tendency, like Germany, let's say. Now, it doesn't mean every German's going to be like that. I know Germans who do a ton of small talk. That's not universal, but you might find certain cultures would be like that versus something like, I don't know, Brazil. Prototypically, you're going to get a lot of small talk and personal conversation and so on. And also the time won't matter as much. You talked about you only have a certain amount of time. That's a conception of time that is limited, that is linear, and so on. Whereas other people have different views of time, right? Because they don't care as much about the deadlines, let's say, or the fact that time might be limited because they're willing to stretch that limitation because it's really about getting to know the other person and that takes the priority. So you would never discount that in favor of getting something done in time and so on. It's just simply not a value. My point is that you're going to get a lot of different perspectives on this. You might be able to guess from someone's background, but you're not going to know. I think then you have to kind of go with what works for you. I think that that's really true. Something that works for you and that's authentic is really what to do. If you want to put people at ease, maybe even part of you likes to get to know someone a little bit. Maybe that's interesting. I mean, you do a podcast, that's a great way to meet people in some way. Practically speaking, I do think that having a little bit of conversation at the beginning is a nice thing. Now, if you're meeting someone once and you're not going to meet them again, it's a little bit sort of ritualistic because it's not like you're continuing the conversation. It's not that you're actually going to advance the relationship much, right? It's more like having an appetizer before a meal. You're sort of easing into it. And that's more about that situation itself. But in an ongoing connection or relationship, I think these things are useful because they can build on each other, for instance, right? So, for instance, in our case, let's say I had to cancel our previous conversation because I had to take my son to the doctor and you asked me about that. And so now I have a son and you were curious about it and we could have talked more about it. I don't know if you wanted to or didn't want to, but that could have been a point of conversation or maybe not. Maybe that's not a connection we have in common. Maybe that's not somewhere where we could build a connection or relationship, which is fine. And so maybe the next thing might be that area of connection, right? I find also that using live in person and asynchronous platforms are very useful for building connection. Now that depends on like on a team or individually. So for instance, if you're on a team, let's say, and maybe time is really tight, maybe someone is waking up very early in the morning in the other side of the world to be able to be on this call. And yes, it would be nice to chit chat about family, but that person, or maybe it's very late for that person, and you're talking about family and so on, but this person's like looking at the clock and saying, "I got to go to sleep," right? So sometimes those considerations are important. That's why the asynchronous platforms are useful. And by asynchronous, I mean in a professional world, I'd say Slack would be an example. In a personal world, it might be Facebook or something like that. But Slack is very useful. And in fact, we have a program that we created based on my first book, Global Dexterity, where we certify people. We certify coaches and trainers and managers and teachers and all sorts of people, therapists, all sorts of people in global dexterity to become a certified global dexterity practitioner. And so we have these cohorts. It's cohort based, and it's usually around 8 people all around the world. And we have a Slack workspace where people can ask questions and make comments, but we've done 13 cohorts so far. I'd say around the fifth or sixth cohort, we realized that we were missing something. And so we created a channel on Slack for photos and fun. And people started posting all sorts of things. It actually was great. It was a way to get to know people. Certain people were more tentative. Other people went right in and showed pictures of their family and all these things. It's like people had their own ways, you know. Some people only showed their dogs because that's personal, but it's semi-personal. But it became a really good way to build a connection. So those are some thoughts.
I love that. I think I'm going to introduce it into our culture brained community actually, because we don't have a space where people share personal stuff. And I love it. And I think it really is the equivalent of small talk in a synchronous environment. And we have a global community. Some members haven't really met in person because of time zone constraints. So I find it like such a great way to get a glimpse into who people are in their personal lives.
Can I just give you one other example of this? I just think it's valuable. Maybe it might inspire someone listening. During COVID, university teaching became virtual. None of us had used Zoom before, and we taught virtually. And I was teaching my classes, MBA classes. I'm a professor at a business school. And I was finding that teaching these classes was so impersonal because I didn't have those moments where I could get to know someone before class, walking in, having a little conversation, all the small talk stuff like, oh, do you have a softball game today? Oh, what do you do? How's that job search? Those little sort of, serendipitous conversations. So what I did is I created this, it was an experiment. I asked every single person in the class to create a personal PowerPoint about themselves, a 3-minute personal PowerPoint where they would share about themselves, their backgrounds, their lives. And we did 2 or 3 of them every single class at the beginning. And it was fantastic. It worked. It was a total experiment, but it worked so well. And you got to see people were posting pictures of their family. This is the fish market in Japan where we walk. Here's the little street we walk down every day to get our fish. And here's the fish market. And here's my mom cooking the fish. And like, you really got this sense of these people. It was great. Yeah. So that was another. Now, I'm not suggesting anyone do exactly that, but maybe that inspires people to create something that can add that type of feeling in personalization.
Yeah, absolutely. And with a dash of creativity, you can really come up probably with a ton of things that, even in a virtual environment, can serve this purpose and create connection. I have a friend who always says connection before content, and he really lives that. I think it really is, irrespective of cultures, it's probably good advice, generally speaking, because as you say, there are very few cultures that wouldn't do small talk, especially now in the multinational business environment that we all operate in. So it's an important skill to have. And it's an important skill to have, as you say, in order to build a relationship. Now, I want us to shift into how we can deepen a relationship and ask you, what are the skills here? So let's say that you've met someone, you build rapport, you kind of know who they are, et cetera, but you will collaborate long term with this person, and you want to know how you should approach it, especially if it's someone from a different culture, because this is what we're talking about. It's not just generic relationship building strategies that we talk about. We talk about strategies for building relationships across cultures, across time zones, across nationalities. So, what do we need to think about when we think about deepening relationships with others?
I mean, there's so much you could say about that. I guess where I'd start is that by deep, we're talking about like a strong, trustworthy professional connection. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking, these are not romantic relationships. These are, strong. And they're not even, honestly, they're not necessarily personal friendships. They could be, they very well could be, and they can sort of transition to that. But we're talking about strong professional relationships. I think that what you're trying to do ideally, and this all has to be authentic. It can't be sort of strategic. I mean, it can be strategic and authentic, but it can't be strategic without being authentic. I think you're trying to show that you're respectful. I think you're trying to show that you're relatable. And I think you're trying to show that you're reliable. So respectful, relatable,
Three R's.
yeah, and reliable. Incidentally, these are not in the book, so this is bonus for the podcast. But I think that
Thank
you're
you.
looking for opportunities to try to deepen the relationship in those ways. That means finding opportunities to create connections. So I'll give you some examples. You happen to be coming in for a business trip to another country. You could just fly in and stay in the hotel, wake up the next morning, go to the business meeting. But what if you come in a day earlier and tour the city and really get to know the city and show interest in the city and interest in that culture? Or maybe you ask for recommendations for restaurants because you're really interested in having a really authentic experience or things like that. You're showing sort of respect and interest and curiosity about that person's
In their culture.
culture. That is something that can start to make someone feel respected. And I think that that's really really important. You can find potentially common interests and you can discover common interests, and those can be threads of ongoing conversation and connection. So for example, I was doing an executive education with a Korean firm, but what I didn't tell you is that when I went in for lunch to meet people at lunch during a break, there was this man who had his head on the table, like he was like asleep on the table, and I didn't know any of these people.
Yeah, it happens a lot in these cultures. I had a similar experience.
Did you really? I didn't know anyone, so I went over to his table and he sort of got up and he was a little bit embarrassed and so I said to him, I forget what I said. I must have said something like, "You're pretty tired, huh?" And so, by the way, that's using it's obvious, but I'm using the context, and I didn't want to make him feel embarrassed, but it was just so obvious. And he said, "Yeah, I have to tell you, I forget what exactly it was, but I have a newborn or I have an infant or a toddler. I have a very, very young child. I can't sleep at home. And so I'm constantly exhausted. And, coming here for this program is actually the only time I can sleep." And so I was laughing because I too, at that time, I had the same situation. I had a toddler and an infant. So two little kids, and I also was not getting sleep, and so we started talking about it, and it was something that just bonded us. He was this Korean engineer, and I was this other, professor teaching this executive education course, but we bonded, and that's finding those similarities. And so, in this particular case, we didn't continue the interaction. I wasn't going to see him again, and so on. But if I had, if we were part of a team or part of an organization, that would be an obvious way to sort of deepen the connection and have recurring conversations over time about that. So those are some examples.
I love these examples. And what strikes me about how you speak about small talk, how you speak about deepening these relationships, we need to notice things and we need to be present in order to be able to do those things, right? You talked about observing something in the room where we're at and commenting about that, or observing that someone is napping and striking a conversation about that. And I often find that we are in this constant rush and thinking about what's next. And very often we are not present to notice those things. So for me, my takeaway from what you're saying is that if we really want to build these relationships, we need to be present with the people that we interact with. And it might sound obvious, but actually, it's not something that we always do. So thanks for this reminder.
I think that a lot of the current perspectives on culture make it hard to be present because if you follow like Hofstede's cultural dimensions, and if you're obsessed with cultural differences and making a mistake, if that's your obsession, if you're filling your head with all these cultural norms and you're afraid of making a mistake and what are you going to do? It's like walking on eggshells. It's the opposite of being present,
You are in your head and just trying to
trying to avoid mistakes. And that's the opposite mindset, inadvertently and ironically, that can make it harder to build connections.
just want to mention for our listeners because I laughed and said it must be common in some cultures because I had a similar experience with Chinese audience. I was running a leadership program for Chinese audience and there were a few people who would have these really short naps on the desks during the program. And apparently this is something that is socially acceptable. So people will literally just put their head on the desk for a couple of minutes and recharge, and it's considered as being respectful in the sense that you charge your battery so that you can be present to the rest of it. And whilst it was surprising to me, to say the least, it was totally normal for that audience. So I don't know if it's true for China generally, but with that particular group, it seemed to be part of the unwritten norms. And I found it funny and interesting. So you talked about respect. You talked about being relatable. And I think that story about having an infant and a toddler is a perfect example. And the third one was reliable. Let's talk about that.
That's a collaborative workplace type of situation. This is with a colleague that this is almost less about culture, although there's probably some cultural elements to it, but that you're dependable, that you can be counted on to do good work, that you're a good teammate, that you can be trusted from a professional standpoint. I think that that's really important because again, we're talking in a professional context here. So you want to be seen and you want to be respectful and relatable for sure. Those are really important for building sort of the personal side of trust, let's say. But you also need to be reliable in terms of your work. Now, culture can come in there. So, for example, there's a problem with producing something, and you come from a culture where it is inappropriate to, or it's maybe you're more from an indirect type of culture where it's not appropriate to tell a superior that there's something wrong or that you made a mistake or whatever it is, and that you need to hint at it indirectly, or it's better to avoid saying the bad news than to say the bad news or whatever it might be. That in your mind you could be respectful, but that could then cause the other person to feel that you're unreliable because you're not producing something on time. So culture can interfere with that, right? To the extent that feedback and deadlines might have and time and timeliness and so on might have cultural differences associated with them. But generally speaking, I think that being reliable has to do with your professionalism.
Yeah. So, only for leaders managing globally distributed teams, what are some actionable strategies that they can implement to strengthen team cohesion and relationships?
There are a lot of things. One of the biggest things is that the team is set up at the beginning in an appropriate way. So that the size of the team is reasonable, that there are norms put into place about when we meet, that people's schedules and time zones are taken into account, that there's no preferred time zone versus another time zone, that it's a conversation about when things happen, because time zones become really important in globally distributed teams because that's a key factor in terms of when you meet. And if it's always India that always has to stay up late and the US always has it at their perfect time, I think you're going to start to have fissures on your team. There's going to be sort of this implied upper class and lower class in terms of the team. And I think that at the very outset becomes very important. I think creating norms for how we act on this team, what the norms are in this team. I mean, we were talking about feedback before. Let's say you've got a team of people from a variety of different cultures. Some cultures, feedback is done in one way, direct, to the point. Maybe in another culture, feedback's done another way. Maybe people tend to use the sandwich approach, where you give a lot of positive feedback and then some negative feedback, but then positive feedback at the end. Maybe there's some other cultures that are very reticent to give any negative feedback or critical feedback at all, and so on. But you can decide as a team leader, recognizing the backgrounds of individuals on the team, you can dictate the norms on this team, and you can explain why these are the norms, and you can make sure that people are comfortable with those norms. And if they're not, you can have conversations with them and try to coach them and so on, because maybe for the work that you're doing, it is essential that you give feedback. It is right. There might be a reason. So you're creating norms at that point. I think on the personal side also. So what you asked is about building relationships. I think that these are safeguards to put into place to increase the odds that people will be able to have relationships and won't have a lot of negative conflict. I also think the asynchronous platform, the sort of fun, platform is important because at the end of the day, you don't want people to take their personal self, stick it in the closet, and put on their professional self and go to work because that's not going to create real connections. I think you have to find a way, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous or whatever, and also ideally getting together in person. I think is very important for virtual teams, ideally, on the relationship side. So those are some thoughts.
I love that. And I know that we are coming to a close. So perhaps just one last question before we move to the rapid fire questions. You've mentioned conflict, you've mentioned negative conflict. And I wonder, in the context of multinational, multicultural teams, are there any pointers that you can share with us as to how we can prevent things from escalating into negative conflict?
Yeah, because conflict is not always bad. I mean, at the end of the day, the only way that you're going to come up with creative, innovative ideas is to have some degree of some element of disagreement, right? Which you could call conflict. So conflict about the ideas, I think, can often be functional, maybe uncomfortable for some people, but functional. Interpersonal conflict, though, can create tension and can damage relationships. I mean, it's a hard question to ask in the abstract. A lot of these questions are very particular to specific situations. But one thing that I think is really important, and we talk about this a little bit in the book, is that to try to manage conflicts, there are three messages that you want to be able to deliver. One message is that I value you. Another message is that I value the relationship. And a third message is that I value myself. That I do have a perspective, and here's my perspective, and I want to add this to the mix, and I want to be assertive and confident enough that I can do that. I'm not going to suppress who I am, but I also really value you, and I really value our relationship. And I think if you're able to show those in an authentic way, those are good safeguards against a relationship becoming broken.
It's so interesting that you would mention these three things because one of the things that I've discovered in my research, I'm now working on my second book on belonging, is that belonging is true belonging is really about three things. One is feeling valued. So obviously when you show people that you value them, this is so important. It really contributes to that sense of belonging. The other one is adding value. And then the third one is having shared purpose and shared values. When it comes to feeling valued, it is also, of course, equally true for ourselves. So we need to value ourselves and our own opinions and so on and so forth. So it just really aligns with my understanding of what belonging is. And it makes total sense for me that through that approach, you would build strong relationships, irrespective of people's cultures and background and so on and so forth. Well, I wish we could continue this conversation, but we are running out of time. So I want us to shift gears now and move to rapid fire questions. Question number one. At CultureBrained, we're on a mission to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. What would be your number one tip to infuse work with a sense of belonging?
Focus on the conviction, the why of what you do, and help everyone do that. Find their deeper sense of why.
What is the sign, or perhaps multiple signs, that the company's culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
I would say people are afraid to speak up, people are afraid to disagree, and people suppress their true feelings about things at work, whether it has to do with the work itself or anything else.
Are there any companies that you admire for the culture? And if yes, why?
To be perfectly honest, I don't feel like I understand the culture of any public organization because I've never been part of it. The only culture that I understand is the culture of the organization that I'm in. So it's that's I know that's not a great answer, but that's my best answer.
I respect it. What book or books on cultural leadership, but perhaps even philosophy or other topics, would you recommend to our listeners?
Let's see. I think one of my favorite books is a book called Difficult Conversations. I love that book. In fact, it inspired sort of the ways that I have written my books. and it falls out of the Harvard program on negotiation. And it's about how to have a difficult conversation with someone else, but also the difficult conversation that's happening inside your mind at the same time. Love that book.
And the final one, and that might take you a little bit longer. What is the question I haven't asked you, but should have in this conversation?
Maybe the question might be, do you feel that you actually answered the question? Do you feel, for me, like, do you feel that you actually addressed this question?
How would you answer this question?
The question is I hope so. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I have to admit, this is a very difficult book to write because it is such a huge topic. You can't go super academic because you're going to lose people, and you want people to actually use this book. It also it can't be just superficial. It needs to be between those two. It has to have some intellectual basis, but presented in a way that's easily digestible. It's got to have memorable stories, and it's got to be something that people could pick up and actually use the tips to improve their relationships. I honestly don't know, and that's why I want people to get the book and to read it and tell me what they think. I really don't.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I want to encourage all of our listeners to grab the book. The title is Forging Bonds in Global Workforce. It's a really great read. I haven't finished mine, but I'm in the middle now, and I would definitely recommend it. Thank you so much for this conversation. I know that for some of our listeners, they might want to learn more about you, about your work, get tips on where to get the book from, what are the best places. So anything really that you put out there in the world that you would like to share with our audience, please let people know where they can find the resources and your work online.
Sure. I think the two best places are LinkedIn and my website. So LinkedIn you can easily find me if you have my name, Andy Molinsky, and my website, which is my name.com, andymolinsky.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. And I also want to acknowledge your dog's contribution to the show. So I think it must be yours, right?
It's my dog, and unfortunately, I can tell you exactly what she's doing. I'm not in the same room, but she is looking at herself in the glass door and barking at herself, and it will go on. I don't know. It will go on forever. So that is what's happening.
I love this.
Yeah,
I love this visual. What a
just a
what
little
a great
dog
way to
looking at
finish the show.
herself. Yeah, that's exactly it.
Don't we do it all, right? From time to time. Maybe we're not barking at ourselves, but yeah, humans can do something similar sometimes as well.
Exactly.
Andy, thank you so much for this conversation. It was such a huge pleasure. And thank you for the work that you are doing. I think, especially these days, it's so incredibly important that we get this right and that we learn to build stronger relationships across boundaries, whatever boundaries there are. So I'm really grateful.
This is really fun. I really enjoyed it. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Bella Silvani, production coordinator.
Thank you for spending your time with Andy and me on this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found this chat insightful, inspiring, or useful, and I'm guessing you did since you are still here, please do me a favor. Take a few seconds to share this episode and have a chat with someone about what you learned. Because when podcasts like this spark conversations, and those conversations turn into actions, that's when we start making real changes in the workplace together. And if you're looking to dig deeper into these topics and connect with others who are shaping the culture within their organizations, consider joining CultureBrained. We put together a cohort of the best, most ambitious culture leaders to help them accelerate progress in the culture work. To find out more and apply, head over to tinyurl.com/culturebrained. The link is in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to get free resources on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: agabayer.com/resources. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, please do it now. That's the best way you can support our work. And finally, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on the platform that you listen to. Thank you, and you are amazing for listening to this point. Not many people do.